Hi there, I'm Anna Aspnes and I want to welcome you to the ArtsyFlowers class in the full version of Adobe Photoshop. In this new creative adventure, you're going to learn how to create your own artsy mixed media style digital elements inspired by flowers using brushes and some of the tools available in Adobe Photoshop CC. If you're new to brushes, you're going to want to refer to the Advanced Brushes in Adobe Photoshop course, which is available from the store at AnnaAspnesDesigns.com. ArtsyFlowers can be used in part or whole in your artsy digital scrapbooking, digital artistry, or other crafting projects. They lend an air of individuality and add a unique imprint to your digital projects and pages. In this particular class, you're going to get the history behind these artsy embellishments with a full understanding of what they are and how to use them in your artistry. You're going to study flower photos and learn various techniques for transforming the imagery into abstract shapes, which can then be used as a pattern to create your artsy embellishments. You're going to understand which digital art supplies you need to have on hand, although all products used in this workshop are included with your course content. You're going to learn my step-by-step approach, or what I call the ArtsyFlower formula, which uses key features in Adobe Photoshop with specified AA digital art supplies to make endless digital painted floral elements of your own. You're going to master the Adobe Photoshop tools needed to make the digital magic happen, and these will include the warp, the lasso, eraser, transform, and paintbrush tools. You'll glean knowledge in applying depth and texture through the use of clipping masks and blending modes. And of course, on top of all of that, you're going to receive all of my insider tips, tricks, and techniques, as well as all the pitfalls to avoid. So without further ado, let's begin. Part 1, Background and Definitions. The ArtsyFlower formula is the art play method used to create the series of artsy painted flowers in the MultiMedia product range. These are located in the Elements category of the Anna Aspnes Designs store at Oscraps. The method has been learned through trial and error over the course of my 15-year digital artistry career, and as far as I know is unique to Anna Aspnes Designs. So if you head to your course content and you go to the ArtsyFlower examples folder, you'll see that I have provided a couple of these multimedia element files to you. There's a couple of previews, so you can see that we have Multimedia Daisies number 2, and these have a level of dimension to them. There's some metallic paint on them, there's some texture, and I have also incorporated dimensional elements with the painted elements, giving them a mixed media style. And then the second example is Multimedia Spring number 1, and these are a little bit more abstract. They don't have any dimensional component to them except for some brushwork, but a lot of art strokes and a very abstract leaning towards the floral elements. And then we have a much brighter set, again very much focused on the abstract paint. There's a little bit of texture involved, but I'm going to be going through and showing you the different ways that you can create some of these elements. These elements are delivered in PNG format, which means that if I drag this file into my Photoshop workspace, you can see that it has the transparent background, and then if we go over to the layers panel, then there is just one layer, so that when I create a new layout, if I go to File, New, and I'm going to select 12 by 12 as my new layout and press Create, and then select the Move tool from the Tools panel and then move that element over, you can see that I can move the entire flower over in one fell swoop. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. Now if we go back to that folder, you can also see that I have provided the PSD file for that particular element, and I'm now going to drag that into my Photoshop workspace. And now you can see we have the same transparent background, but when we go over to the layers panel, we have multiple layers, and this is the beauty of these mixed media style elements. They combine a variety of digital art supplies with the power of Photoshop in this PSD multi-layer format, and it can be customized and manipulated as preferred for any of your digital scrapbooking or artistry projects. So if we now go back to that PNG file, select it in the layers panel, and then drag that down to the trash can to remove it, and now we can return to the PSD file. I'm going to select the last layer in the layer stack, hold down my Shift button on my keyboard and click on that first layer to select all the layers that make up this flower element. And then using that same move tool from the tools panel, we can then move that flower element over onto our canvas. And it looks exactly the same as the PNG file, except for the fact that we can now begin modifying this element to suit our needs. So for example, you can turn off the visibility of any of the layers in the layers panel by clicking the eye icon next to any of the layers. You can see that we have the flower and the flower shadow layer. If we wanted to just use the stem layer, so it could be that we could combine two different multimedia elements by using the stem from one flower with the head of another. So that's one way that you can modify. You can also delete elements if you are certain that you won't use them again and you are concerned about file space. And of course you can drag any of these layers down to the trash can to remove them. I prefer to turn off that eye icon instead, just because it gives me a little bit more flexibility. We can also go in and perhaps open up another one of these PSD files. In the same way that you can delete elements, you can also add them. So say for example I wanted to add this yellow splatter to my element here, then I would select that layer in the layers panel, and then with the move tool selected I would drag that over into my workspace. And you can't see it very well right now, so I'm going to select that background layer and go to Edit Fill and go to 50% gray. Ensure the preserve transparency box is unchecked and then click OK, and now we can have a bit better view of the elements that we have in our flower. So I just need to go back. With the auto select option selected, I'm going to just click on that splatter to locate it, as opposed to trying to find it in my layers stack. I'm going to unselect that so that I don't accidentally click on any of these other layers, and then move it down below the layer stack. So not only can you add layers to the different elements, but you can also reorder them by moving them, dragging and dropping them between layers in the layer stack, depending on how you want them to look on your digital project. You can also recolor any of these layers, so you can go to Edit, Fill, and say for example I wanted to make that more white, then I would select white using the color picker option and then click OK. We want to make sure we have the preserve transparency box checked. If we don't, it's going to fill that entire layer with color. So I'm going to go to Edit, Undo Fill, or you can press Control or Command plus C on your keyboard to undo that action, and then go back up to Edit, Fill, and then ensure that Preserve Transparency box is checked. And this fill color option is a really handy tool for when you are working with one color flat elements. If you're working with the more dimensional elements that have more than one color or more than one shade in them, then you are going to want to use the hue and saturation tool. So if I go ahead and select that stem and we go back to Edit, Fill, I can demonstrate this. So I'm going to click on the downward facing arrow and access the color, and then this time I'm going to sample a green color. And if I go ahead and click OK, with that preserve transparency box checked, you can see that we lose all of the dimension. So Edit, Undo, and then this time I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. And then this allows us to change the hue of that stem while retaining the different shades within that hue. You also have the option to press this colorize box if you want a more monotone look to the element. And then of course you can also change the saturation, move the slider to the right if you want it much brighter, or to the left if you want it to be more on the gray side of the color spectrum. And then you can also change the brightness or the lightness. And then you can either cancel or click OK. You can rotate or resize any of the elements on these individual layers independently, and to do this you're going to select the Move tool from the Tools panel and ensure that you have this Show Transform Controls box checked, which is located in the options bar at the top of your screen. And this allows you to view the bounding box that goes around the element that you have selected in the Layers panel. If I select a different element or a different layer, then you can see that that bounding box changes its location to surround the element that you have selected. So I'm going to go back to that stem layer, hover your mouse or your pen over the corner point of the bounding box, and then you can see that we have this diagonal double-ended arrow. And this means that we can resize our box. And to do this, you're going to hold down the Shift button on your keyboard, and then you're going to click down on that corner point, and then you can drag that box either outward to make the element larger, or drag it inward to make it much smaller. I don't recommend that you enlarge an element more than about 25 to 30% without the pixels being stretched and causing a fuzzy appearance on your image, and you'll certainly see that when you go to print with that particular element. But you can obviously make that element much smaller, as small as you'd like it to be, really. And then to rotate this element, you're going to pull that cursor out and watch it change from a diagonal double-ended arrow to an arced double-ended arrow. And when you get this icon, then you can click down and you can begin to rotate it. Both these actions work in the same way, that when you have either the size or the rotation as you want it, you can either click on the check mark at the top of your screen. There's a check mark and a cancel mark to either accept or decline the transformation, or you can double click within the area of the bounding box to achieve the same effect. You can modify any of these layers in your embellishment using the clipping mask function. So say for example I wanted to enhance this stem that we've been working with so far. I would select that layer in the Layers panel, and then I would perhaps go and find a different layer. I'm going to select that auto select box when we have the Move tool selected from the Tools panel, and then maybe bring over this paint element here, and then maybe place that so that the curve extends around the curve of our stem element. And then you can go Control or Command plus Alt or Option plus G, or you can go to Layer, Create Clipping Mask. And now you can see that that paint layer has been clipped to the stem layer. So this is a technique that we will be using as we move forward in creating these artsy flower style embellishments. But just wanted to point out that it's also a technique that you can use when you are working with the ArtsyFlowers or the multimedia files found at Anna Aspnes Designs. And then you can actually take this technique one step further by applying either a blending mode or a layer style. So you can go to your blending modes at the top of the layers panel, and you can experiment by applying different options. So obviously different blending modes will yield different results depending on the layers that you're working with in the clipping mask. You can also add a layer style to any of the layers. So let's go and select that splatter layer that we were working with earlier, and then go up to Layer, Layer Style, and then you have this flyout menu that lists all of the layer styles that are available to you. You're probably going to just use a few of them, maybe Bevel Emboss, Drop Shadow. We can go ahead and add a drop shadow to this paint style by clicking on that option, and it will open up a dialog box that allows us to make changes to the settings that are currently available to us. So right now we have a blend mode of multiply. We can change the color to a darker color, so perhaps a dark brown. I like the opacity to usually be around 40%, and then I like my angle to be around 120, and then you can also change the distance, and you can see how that makes this splatter sort of pop off the page. And you can see that I applied drop shadow layer styles to these petals to yield the same effect. So once you're happy with that drop shadow layer style, then you can click OK, or you can move on to perhaps add different layer styles, such as maybe a bevel emboss. And you would check that box next to the bevel and emboss option before clicking on that label to be taken to the options that are relevant to that particular layer style. So you can then start playing around with the different options. It's currently on pillow emboss, so we'll change that to maybe a inner bevel, which will be much better, and then we can increase that shadow mode to add more of a shadow on there. So if you wanted to make it more dimensional, you could do that. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that, but keep the drop shadow, and then go ahead and click OK. And then finally you have two options at the top of your layers panel, the opacity and the fill, both of which allow you to change the transparency of any of the layers in your Artsy flower. They both work fairly similarly. The only difference is that the fill will affect some of the blending modes in a different way than the opacity. So play around with both of them and see which one you like best. I tend to gravitate towards the fill when I'm working in Adobe Photoshop CC. So if we go ahead and select that flower center, and then we can go and we can change the opacity, and you can see that it's currently on linear light, or we can change the fill. And depending on the color and the blending mode, it may or may not behave differently, but it just allows us to soften that brush stroke that we clipped to our stem. So that's one way that I would use the opacity or the fill. Another place I might use it would be the stains here. It looked really great on that lighter background, but as we now have a darker background, it would serve as well to perhaps minimize that just a little bit more and bring that opacity slider down. I brought it down from about 76 to 26%. You've got to be very careful about changing the opacity of some of the other layers. For example, if we decided we wanted to reduce the opacity of the stem, all this is going to do is make the stem look washed out. And of course, because we have that cast shadow beneath the stem, then we're seeing that dark color show through our element, which is not what we want. So I'm going to bring that back up to 100%. Another place where the opacity and fill come in quite handy is with the drop shadows, of course. So when you have a shadow on a darker paper, you're going to want that shadow to be much darker. And then conversely, if you have a much lighter paper, then you can bring that fill down. If I leave that really high up and then go and select that background layer, go to Edit Fill, and then go back to the white background and click OK, then you can see that it's just really too much now that we've increased it. But if we bring that back down, then it's much more suited to the background that we currently have, the white background. So you can see how having these ArtsyFlowers in a multi-layered format is really helpful when you are using them, because it allows you to use them in many different ways and just get more out of the element. So now that you understand the foundation of these ArtsyFlower elements and how they can be used, we can move on to the next video where we will start looking into the task and get down to the business of creating some of these ArtsyFlowers of our own.